I'd like to thank everyone for joining us here today. My name is Megan Williams, and I am the Director of Support Services at AGI. If you're joining us for the first time at AGI, Alzheimer Group, we support those people living with dementia and as well those who are supporting them through programming for people living with dementia, counseling, support groups for caregivers, and educational workshops. Today's lecture is made possible by the generous support of the Lindsay Memorial Foundation. AGI is a charitable organization, and we rely on support from donations. This is a free lecture, but you are welcome to donate at any time by calling us or visiting our website. Our contact information will be sent to you via email. We will have a few other educational programs coming up later this month and in October. So please stay tuned to your email and make sure that you are on our mailing list. Just a few housekeeping items. Please keep yourself on mute. If you have to step out at any time, that's not a problem. And the lecture will be recorded and will be sent to you via email. Without further ado, let's begin with today's lecture. I'd like to introduce my colleague, Rennie Bimman, AGI's counselor, who will be guiding us through ambiguous loss. We will be taking questions at the end of Rennie's lecture. Please make use of the chat function, which you can find at the bottom of your screen to send questions as they come up through the lecture, and I will do my best to read them at the end if we have time. Rennie?
Thank you, Megan. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm very happy to be able to be here together in this virtual way, despite these challenging times. Today, we're going to be exploring the topic of ambiguous loss. We're going to spend lots of time discussing what that means, but first, I'd like everyone to take a moment to think about what comes to your mind when you hear words like grief or grieving or mourning. I think that often when we hear words like that, we think about death. Generally, we focus on death when we think about loss and responding to it. But there are so many other types of loss that extend far beyond just death, and especially in the context of dementia, where the progression of the disease means that the person living with dementia and those around them often face a steady cascade of losses on an everyday basis. With dementia, we may feel like a person is not here in the same way that they were before. We may lose elements of a person and their abilities long before losing them to death. And the losses that come along the way with dementia and how we can grieve them are what we're here to talk about today. Now, what is ambiguous loss? Ambiguous loss is a term coined by a researcher named Pauline to refer to situations of loss in which a person is physically present, but psychologically absent in some way. This kind of loss lacks the closure and the finality of loss that happens with death, which can make this very confusing. It can make it paralyzing and painful. With dementia, ambiguous loss can be particularly challenging, and we're going to talk about why. So let's ask ourselves, what makes ambiguous loss so different from loss by death or other types of loss? When a death occurs, we have a script to follow. So there are rituals like a funeral or a memorial ceremony. There are traditions that we follow, like visiting people who are mourning or bringing them food. We know what we're supposed to say and do, like saying, "I'm sorry," even if it feels uncomfortable. These are all ways that people show recognition and acknowledge that a loss has occurred, which gives permission to the mourners to grieve that loss. With dementia, we or our society in general doesn't know what we're supposed to say and do. People may not even know or understand that loss has occurred, or they may know, but they may feel so uncomfortable that they're reluctant to speak about it. Dementia is quite stigmatized and often, unfortunately, viewed negatively because maybe it brings up deep fears for people about their own health. For these reasons, it becomes very hard to have any recognition externally that loss is occurring. And without acknowledgement, the people experiencing these losses may feel like they haven't been granted that permission to grieve. They may feel like they cannot grieve, or they shouldn't grieve, or they're not allowed to grieve. And to respond to that, what we're here to try to do today is to acknowledge those losses together. Let's first talk about some specific reasons why the ambiguous losses of dementia can be challenging. First of all, dementia can feel very up and down. On some days, the person you're caring for, if you're a caregiver, might know who you are and remember your name. And on others, they might not at all. On the days they can, you might feel a sense of hope, but then on days they can't, you might feel struck by a sense of loss, but not sure how to feel or whether you can give yourself permission to grieve because it can change so much and you might never feel sure what will happen next. There is no finality and no certainty with these losses. Dementia is a progressive disease and it can feel like it's just one thing to lose after another. With a death, by contrast, grief can feel sudden and overwhelming at first, and for some people it lessens over time. It can, and that's not a rule. But with grief that's related to an ongoing chronic progressive illness, the source of the grief is always there. So it can seem to go on and on. Some might even call this chronic grief. And again, because there's often so much stigma surrounding dementia that makes acknowledging its existence at all really difficult. Therefore, acknowledging the losses that it engenders is even harder and can be all the more isolating. Pauline, again, who invented this term ambiguous loss, talks about the limbo of not knowing what will happen next or what will be the next thing to go. This limbo can be really challenging. There can be a lot of uncertainty. We know dementia is a progressive disease, but how quickly or slowly will it progress for the person that I know? Will this person forget who I am? When will that happen? And this limbo that we're talking about relates to another grief reaction that's called anticipatory grief. So anticipatory grief is a grief reaction that occurs before an impending loss. You might find yourself worrying about a decline in someone's abilities in the future. For instance, maybe you feel like you're dreading a time to come when the person that you know can no longer get dressed by themselves. You might find yourself wondering about your own emotional reaction to symptoms that might appear in the person you know in the future. Wondering, how am I going to feel? Maybe you're worried that one day you'll be devastated when the person you know forgets who you are or doesn't recognize you for a moment. Maybe you're worried about or anticipating changes in your role, in your interactions, in your environment. Maybe you're concerned that one day you're going to need to be responsible for all the banking and all the finances, and that's something you've never handled before. I think it's important to note that right now, the whole world is grieving in ways we never have before. With COVID-19, we already have so much to grieve. Most of us have never seen death on such a massive scale, or fear of death on such a massive scale, or this acute awareness of our own mortality in the way that we're feeling it now. We're also grieving the loss of our normal lives, the things we used to be able to do with ease or with enjoyment, but now which carry so much risk, especially if you're an older person. We also have this sense of more bad things that might be coming. We hear about the chance of a second wave. We worry what winter weather is going to be like in these times. All of that lines up with anticipatory grief. And I believe this can be even more amplified for people who are living with dementia and those who are caring for them. For instance, maybe you're a caregiver and you're already worried about needing to move the person you're caring for into long-term care one day, which already has its challenges. But now you may find yourself wondering if you're going to be able to visit them, or if they'll be okay there if COVID heightens again, let's say. Maybe you're a caregiver living at home with the person you're caring for, and now you've lost your normal routine and your normal activities that you enjoy, and maybe you find you have much less time to take breaks, and you're running into more conflicts maybe the more you spend time around the person that you're caring for. Or maybe now that you have all this time at home together, you're noticing more changes in the person that you're caring for, which is hard to see. COVID, I think, almost magnifies a lot of the losses that people living with dementia and their caregivers are already feeling. And we're going to spend some time now exploring what some of these losses are. One example is the loss of what we might call everyday experiences that feels very salient. For instance, maybe your partner is living with dementia and she's no longer able to hold a conversation with you while you're eating a meal together. But you always used to talk about your days together as a couple over dinner. There's a psychologist called Carolyn Fagelson who calls this the effect of the doppelganger at the dinner table. You know, you're in the same place, everything looks the same, your partner is still there, but you're no longer able to interact in the same way, and that's hard. Another example of these everyday experiences might be, you know, the ability to go grocery shopping together without challenges. Like, you know, now you might have to make sure that somebody who's living with dementia knows where they're going in the store, and maybe you no longer can expect that they can go find an item independently without you joining them. Especially with COVID, I think this becomes even more challenging in terms of needing to make sure a person with dementia can respect the safety protocols that are in a place like a grocery store. As well, we can look at loss of abilities like continence, like the ability to chew or to swallow, like the ability to know the people close to you if you're living with dementia. These losses of abilities are felt by people living with dementia themselves and the people close to them, each in their own way. Another important loss is that holidays and celebrations can sometimes bring about feelings of loss. They can be painful with dementia. Maybe, for instance, your wife always prepped weeks ahead of time for your children's birthdays, but now she's unprepared. She wasn't able to remember that the birthday's coming up, and she feels guilty that she's forgotten about it, and maybe it's uncomfortable for you, or it's sad for you as the caregiver to remind her of that. Another example, if we think about Mother's Day can be really challenging without your mother or your mother figure present, physically and or psychologically present. So consider, you know, what if, for instance, it's Mother's Day, and Mother's Day of this year was pretty much during the height of COVID. And if your mother was living in long-term care at that time, it's possible you weren't able to see her on that day. Or on the other hand, what if your mother was able to celebrate with you on that day, on Mother's Day in person, but she wasn't really psychologically present for it? Or what if she did come again in person and enjoyed that Mother's Day celebration with you, but afterward she forgot that it happened? It makes it hard when you see the rest of the world acknowledging and celebrating Mother's Day without a clue or without a thought as to how that day might feel different and difficult for you. I think this next graphic here, and I'll give you a moment to look at it, helps illustrate that even without significant holidays, regular days can be hard enough too. You know, it's one thing when everyone else is celebrating a holiday and you're feeling left behind, and it's also a challenge on a regular day-to-day when you're still feeling pinned down by loss, but everybody else is going about business as usual. Often people feel as well a sense of loss regarding anticipating future celebrations, maybe an upcoming wedding or a graduation or milestones like that. People with dementia have trouble thinking into the future. So remembering things like, for instance, that your grandchild got engaged. So you might not be able to engage with them and enjoy that excitement in the same way as you might have used to be able to. As well, often people experience a sense of loss of what may have seemed to them to be their golden years lying ahead. They may feel like they've lost that. And that has a lot to do with feeling a loss of future opportunities for making memories together. At the same time, people often feel a loss of the ability to reminisce about past holidays, past milestones, including difficult past experiences like losses. You know, for instance, maybe you shared a big loss in your life with your partner, and previously you were able to speak to them about it and find support in each other, but you can't any longer, and that's really difficult. Another big example of loss is when someone living with dementia moves into long-term care. This can be really difficult and even traumatic for some people. It can bring about feelings of guilt, of regret, or of frustration. And there's an attitude out there, especially in early stages of the disease, that placement in long-term care is a sign of defeat. And all of those feelings can sometimes mean that placement in long-term care becomes a peak in a caregiver's grief process. When a person living with dementia moves into long-term care or moves out of their home of origin, if their caregiver was living with them before, that caregiver may be left behind with an empty house. And then they need to cope with the loss of not having that person around them in terms of how they define home. They may be feeling conflicting feelings of, on the one hand, the person I'm caring for is better off now in a safe environment. On the other hand, feeling an intense emotional loss. As well, sometimes other people don't check in as much with people once someone moves into long-term care. Maybe they don't check in with the person living with dementia or with the caregiver because they assume, well, they're taken care of and they don't need it. But that can leave people feeling really left behind. So here's another little graphic that might feel relatable. I'll give you a moment with this one. I think that having to explain dementia and then somehow needing to comfort other people when they hear about it can make you almost not want to explain. And that seems fair. Another challenge might be that because people aren't able to sit with the grief that accompanies dementia, sometimes they might react in an attempt to take away its burden. For instance, your friend might say to you, "Oh, your wife's license was taken away? Oh, good. That means she's safer now." But you and your wife might be experiencing a really acute sense of loss because driving was really important to her. And this is now a huge cut to her autonomy. It can be really hard when you're not feeling the way people expect you to feel. Another example might be that you tell someone about the diagnosis of your father, for example, and they expect that you're miserable all the time and not able to enjoy time with him anymore. Well, maybe you do have a lot of wonderful moments with your father now and you aren't miserable all the time, but the fact that people expect that of you can be kind of isolating and might make you feel some confusion or dissonance or even guilt. Another loss is the loss of the ability to communicate with the person you're caring for. There are big changes to the brain caused by dementia, including short-term memory loss and difficulty with word finding, just to name a couple, which can make it hard to carry a conversation with the person, perhaps in the same way that you were used to throughout your relationship. Now, this is not to say that communication is not possible, but it may certainly look different now, and that can be difficult. As a caregiver or as a person living with dementia, you might be feeling the loss of your occupation, of your job, and along with that, the loss of your sense of personal competency and fulfillment. You might be feeling a loss of control over the events in your life. You might as well be feeling the loss of social and recreational interaction. Maybe you can't go out anymore with your loved one, or you feel uncomfortable doing so, or you can't go to the same places that you used to frequent. And COVID, of course, makes this even more challenging. You might be feeling a loss of freedom, of flexibility, of your ability to be spur of the moment, to come and go as you please as a caregiver. As a caregiver, things must now be carefully planned and structured you might be feeling. As an example, it might not be so easy to, try and go out and see a movie on a whim in an evening if the person that that's living with dementia might get tired halfway through and need to leave or be distressed. And of course, COVID adds even more challenges to that ability to be spontaneous like that and the things that you can do spontaneously. Another big type of loss is the loss that has to do with role changes. Because of the losses you're experiencing as the caregiver, you may need to take on new tasks, things maybe you took for granted that perhaps your partner always handled if it's your partner who has dementia. You might be feeling like you have to shoulder everything now and that COVID can amplify that. However, there is support available and AGI is one place where that's true. And keep in mind, you may not actually need to shoulder everything yourself. Another big role change you might feel, for example, is that the person who was previously your main source of comfort and your main source of support suddenly might begin to behave in ways that are bringing discomfort and distress and frustration to you. Maybe you've lost a trusted confidant, and maybe now you must consider where you can turn for support. You might also be feeling losses or changes to your relationships with other people in your life. Maybe now you have to devote so much of your energy to the care of your mother who's living with dementia that it strains your relationship with your own spouse. As well, different members of a relationship might be grieving differently. For instance, a person with dementia might be grieving the loss of their autonomy, while their caregiver is grieving the loss of the person they knew. Both are grieving together, but also uniquely and independently. Losses can also come in the form of regrets. Maybe you're feeling like you didn't value your relationship previously or earlier or enough. As well, we know that dementia is progressive, which means losses continue over time. Dementia is incurable and it's terminal, and that can be really difficult to wrap our heads around. Ultimately, when a person with dementia dies, it will have an impact in and of itself. First of all, it's very possible that when somebody who's been living with dementia dies, it can bring a sense of relief or closure, and that's normal, especially because the caregivers and the person's entourage have been faced with loss after loss over potentially many years, and the conclusion of that pattern can bring release. As well, if you're living as a caregiver right now, it can also be normal to think about and look ahead to a time when you might feel that release. There's nothing wrong with that, with saying maybe sometimes I just wish this was over. However, it can be really difficult when we live in a society that, again, has very prescribed ways of responding to loss. For instance, you're supposed to be sad when someone dies. If you're feeling differently from what that social norm is telling you, no matter how human what you're feeling is, it can be really challenging and isolating. I do want to note as well that the death of someone living with dementia can also in and of itself bring on a new and different wave of grief. No one grieves in exactly the same way, and what we will continue to speak about is that there is no normal here, and whatever you're feeling is okay. The grief that happens after a person with dementia dies may be the product of the grieving that you've done along the way, the work you've done to process the feelings that have been arriving. Acknowledging and processing that grief and the feelings that accompany it throughout the course of dementia can reduce the burden of grief that death ultimately brings later on. We're going to talk now about the feelings and the responses that accompany grief and loss. So first of all, there's no normal with grief. Whether it's a death or whether it's any kind of loss, everyone finds their way through it in their own unique way. There are some stages that have been set out by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who's a key theorist in the field of grief, because they're often seen in responses to grief. And you may recognize those stages here with a little bit of a twist. You'll see them: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. I'll give you a moment to look over them on the slide. So at the same time, though, these are some examples of reactions to grief that might come up, these stages might not all appear They might not appear in this order, or there could be myriad other responses when we're facing a loss. There are also plenty of other theories out there regarding grief as it relates to caregivers. There's one study that looked at how grief for caregivers might go through stages like denial, over-involvement, anger, guilt, and acceptance. Everyone goes through loss differently, and these differences can be caused by many different factors, including, for instance, what your relationship to the person with dementia is. For instance, grief patterns and processes are often quite different for children as compared to spouses. So what I'd like to do is flip this question to you now. And I'm going to ask that you use the chat function to reply to how do the changes and losses of dementia make you feel? There are no wrong answers here. So you can go right ahead and type those into the chat, and in a moment I'll ask Megan to read some of them aloud for us.
So the chat, for those of you who don't know, it's at the very bottom of your screen in the middle. And you can just type and some of the answers, Rennie.
Sure.
So far, how these changes and losses of dementia make people feel. Frustration, sadness. Another one says sad and scared. It's a roller coaster of emotions. Angry to see the changes. Someone referred to it as seeing someone disappear slowly. Confused, isolated, anxious, burnt out, powerless. Sad to see, you know, those close around you, the losses.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we can see from what you've read out so far, Megan, what a huge range there are of all the possible emotions that we can feel in response to these changes, in response to these losses. You know, some in particular that I heard, feelings of confusion, of anger, of frustration, sadness. There's really a whole gamut out there. And thank you everybody for being so honest about how you're feeling. As any other responses are coming in, you know, feel free to keep putting them in the chat, and everybody, you can have a look yourselves at the chat box and see what other people are feeling. You might find you have things in common. Thank you.
Also loneliness, Rennie. That was
absolutely. And I heard something before about isolation as well. It can be hard to feel like you're on your own. So I'd like to spend a moment to make a bit of a note about acceptance. We heard acceptance come up in a couple slides ago when we looked at the stages of grief. I think we live in a society that expects that if you just take an I can do it attitude, all of your challenges will melt away. It's almost as if we're expected to move on and get through adversity, all towards some idea of closure. But closure can't really happen, especially when you're facing the constant losses of dementia. To cope, we may need to let go of the idea that we can find certainty and try to get comfortable with this ambiguity of it all. If we look at this graphic on the screen here, moving on or accepting loss doesn't seem helpful if it means that you're not processing it and you're losing your connection to what it is that you've lost. And I know, as a disclaimer, this graphic clearly refers to loss by death, but I think it can feel relatable to dementia if you replace the headstone in the image with any type of loss. The headstone could represent the loss of the ability to, again, to converse with your partner in the way that you used to because of changes to their brain, or the loss of your ability to travel somewhere warm this winter as you might have done in the past with your family if the person that you know who's living with dementia is no longer so easily able to, or COVID is making that challenging on top of it all, for instance. This idea of moving on from the grief of dementia kind of carries this connotation that you just leave behind the person that you're caring for, and that shouldn't be the case. Grieving dementia doesn't mean you lose the relationship with the person that you're caring for. It means that you reconfigure it. Accepting things that aren't within your control is not easy. And yet the word acceptance is kind of thrown around a lot in terms of grief. And I think sometimes it sounds like something that easily gets tied up with a bow. But in reality, this isn't the case. The way that I understand acceptance is this. It doesn't mean that you have to agree with or like what has happened or what has changed or what is bothering you about a situation. And to give some examples, it could be that somebody you know is no longer able to make the bed like they used to, or their sleep routine has changed and they're not getting up as easily in the morning, or you're no longer able to do a favorite activity together. Acceptance means finding a way to live alongside this thing that you don't like, whatever it is, and adapt to it so that it feels more okay. So for instance, if your partner has dementia and they're no longer able to make the bed the way they used to, acceptance might mean letting them make it which way they want to, but then coming back yourself later on when they're not around and fixing it so that you can be comfortable with the way it is too. It does not mean that you like the fact that they're losing this ability. It does not mean you like the way they made the bed, but it means you've found a way that makes it more comfortable for you to live with it. This is another way of expressing this whole idea that acceptance doesn't mean getting up and moving on and not grieving anymore. Grief is ongoing, especially with ambiguous loss. And acceptance may mean finding a manageable way to literally carry that grief alongside you. I will note that grief is not always linear like this. Sometimes I want to draw arrows and circles, as you see here all over this picture, because some days your grief might feel more manageable and like you have room to breathe again. On other days and other moments, especially given how up and down dementia can be, you might be feeling crushed by the weight of it. And that's normal. So our next step is, how do we get there? How do we move toward accepting a particular loss or loss in general? So sometimes people talk about coping. I have a colleague who just hates the word coping because what does it really mean if we think about it? When you're coping, does it mean you're suddenly okay with what's going on? Does it mean you've suddenly become able to master this big dark maze that you're seeing on your screen here? No. The way I look at coping is that it means looking at the things that we can do when we're facing very heavy, ambiguous loss, and looking at what we can control when dementia is often so out of our control in order to try to feel better. So we're going to take a look at what we can do. One thing you can do is this. Think about how you got through other losses in your life, including deaths, but not only that. We can also expand this concept beyond death, as we're doing today. For instance, did you ever lose a job? Did you ever grow distant from someone who had once been a close friend? Did you ever make a move to a new city or a new country that you knew little about? Did you ever experience a painful breakup or a divorce? Did you ever support someone else who was going through any of these things? Ask yourself, what was helpful then? Perhaps who was helpful then? Can you identify any elements of how you approached X loss in the past that could be helpful to you now? What's also important to consider is what was not helpful to you. Can you learn from those experiences in terms of what you can do differently now or what you can seek out differently now? We've talked about how ambiguous loss is particularly difficult because it's hard to feel like you can truly grieve. Try to find ways to give yourself permission to grieve the losses you're experiencing, and we'll talk about some ways to do that. Pauline Boss, again, who's the pioneer of this idea of ambiguous loss, prompts us to consider the idea of observing a ritual for a given loss that you're experiencing in a way that's personally meaningful for you. That could be lighting a candle. It could be playing a song that's very meaningful for you or brings you comfort. It could mean holding a gathering or a ceremony. It could also mean reminiscing on what has been lost. So for instance, if you were to lose your driver's license, if you have dementia and you're losing your driver's license, and maybe earlier in your life you took a special family road trip, your family could sit down with you and spend some time recollecting the positive memories you made in your life on that trip when you were driving, in the interest of actively acknowledging that driving is something important to you that you are losing and the meaning that it holds. Marking a loss can serve as a way for you as a caregiver or as someone living with dementia to personally acknowledge and face the loss at hand and take permission to grieve it. It can also be important to involve the community around you in these rituals, just as one's community tends to be particularly present in the event of loss by death. Sometimes this necessitates calling people in, inviting them to be there with you in your grief and telling them what you would find helpful. Often with the extreme stigma of dementia, people back away because they don't know what to do and they don't want to misstep. As hard as it is, sometimes it can be really helpful to let people in and tell them what you need or what you want from them. Something else you can do is you can try to honor and to celebrate what strengths and capacities are still present in the person you know with dementia. What can you still do? What can you still enjoy together? For instance, can you look at a beautiful sunset together while you're out for a walk, even if that person might not remember tomorrow? Can you celebrate the moments when this person that you care for knows who you are, even if in other moments they don't? For some, it might also be helpful to focus on what new capacities or behaviors the person is displaying that might be positive. For instance, maybe because of an increased lack of inhibition, your mother, who maybe was historically not very warm, is now very affectionate, and you appreciate this change. So Pauline Boss proposes 6 guidelines as themes to focus on for facing ambiguous loss, which applies to grief in the context of dementia for caregivers, recognizing that not everyone will respond in the same way. One thing that she suggests is making ways to find meaning. Making meaning can be very hard with ambiguous loss, and the first step in addressing this is to name for yourself that this is a loss that doesn't have resolution. And then from there, to figure out what that means for you. How do you make sense of this? How do you live alongside it? For instance, if a person can't participate in meaningful traditions in the same way that they used to, find a way to adapt that tradition so that they can, and that it can still be meaningful for everyone. Rituals can help us find meaning in loss. For instance, if the person that you know can no longer be in your family home for Thanksgiving, for instance, maybe you bring their favorite part of the dinner to their long-term care home and you have your own mobile celebration if that kind of visit is possible. The idea is to find hope and to find meaning in identifying how life can continue in a new way. Boss also suggests that when we're facing ambiguous loss, we need to temper our need for mastery. This has to do with letting go of what we cannot control. It's very human to want to feel in control, and it's hard to face the fact that with dementia, so much becomes guesswork and out of our control. It can be important to acknowledge that the world is not always fair and to take the blame off yourself for that. We must try to come to terms with uncertainty while also noticing what we can control, like this idea of continuing the family tradition of Thanksgiving, but in a new way. It can also mean finding things that you can master and feel in control of, like self-mastery, like things like an instrument or exercising or mindfulness, to take charge of something for yourself instead. Boss also talks about reconstructing identity, which means actively learning to think of yourself and the person you're caring for in a new way, whether you're living with dementia or you're living near it. Acknowledging and naming that, for instance, maybe you're now the caregiver for someone who used to be a caregiver for you. Being a caregiver doesn't mean losing the relationship with the person you're caring for, but reconfiguring it. Asking yourself questions like, how is my identity changing? What was it like before? Who am I now? Giving yourself time to think about yourself too and how you're changing and your role is changing, and not just focusing on how the person you're caring for is changing. It can also be really important to remind yourself of the growth and the value in the work that you're doing as a caregiver. You may have developed new skills or discovered resilience that you didn't know you were capable of, and those are things to be proud of. It's also important to try to listen when other people around you recognize that and remind you of what you're doing well. As well, normalizing ambivalence. It's natural to have conflicted feelings when there's all this ambiguity. You might feel angry, you might feel glad that you still have this person there, you might find yourself wishing things were different or wishing it was over or feeling guilty at yourself, all at the same time, and that's normal. It's important to feel okay with these conflicted feelings and say them out loud instead of denying the ambivalence that you're feeling or being angry about it. Revising attachment. Again, there doesn't need to be an end to the relationship with the person that you know. Ambiguous loss necessitates that there is still an attachment to that person, but it's painful in how it's changing. If you can grieve what is lost and celebrate what remains at the same time, this will be helpful. It's also important to develop and nurture attachments by being with other people socially who can be fully present for you as well. Discovering hope. It's hard to do this without closure, but the goal is that when you gain more comfort with all this ambiguity and uncertainty, it's easier to feel free to imagine new hope. Maybe it means redefining what you think of as fairness or justice, especially when dementia can really feel unfair sometimes. Maybe it means finding hope in new ways, like even though you're stuck at home right now and you can't leave the person you're caring for alone with dementia and COVID all on top of each other, maybe you started using your front porch more than ever, or you found all these computer activities that you're enjoying. Another strategy that relates to the idea of reconstructing identity is the concept of both and thinking. So rather than saying, I either love my partner who has dementia exactly as they are now, or I miss how they used to be, try to say, I both love my partner who has dementia exactly as they are now, and I miss how they used to be. Try that on for size. Sorry, I just have a frozen computer for a moment here. But the next thing we're going to talk about is that there are many reasons why it's important to name an experience and grieve and process the losses that occur in everyday experiences when we're caring for someone with dementia. The one reason for that, and I'll just flip my slide now, one reason that we need to do this grief work while you are living the role of being a caregiver is that it's important because, as I've said, it ultimately has an impact on the grief you experience after the person you're caring for dies. It can ease that burden. Another reason it's important to make time for yourself as a caregiver to do this processing. There is an age-old analogy about how when you're on an airplane, the safety video that comes up always tells you to make sure your own mask is on before you help someone more vulnerable with their oxygen mask. The moral of the story is that you can't take care of someone else if you're not taking care of yourself. Your own well-being is crucial. Another reason is it's also important that you're aware of and that you're processing your own grief so that you can support the person you're caring for in the grief that they're experiencing. And it's also important to consider that your life and your role may not look as it does right now at some point in the future. Sometimes when a caregiver ultimately loses the person they've been caring for, they may feel a variation of what we call empty nest syndrome. They may suddenly lose the object of their care and their attention, and they may face challenges in terms of not knowing what to put their energy into, not knowing how to structure their time, or not knowing how to live for themselves without living for the care of another person. Caregivers also may feel a variation of that empty nest syndrome when and if the person that they're caring for moves into long-term care. It's so important to take time to build relationships and other passions and activities for your current self as a caregiver, while also keeping in mind that these things will be very valuable for your future self. I'm going to now present some strategies, and these are all with the goal of finding ways to take care of yourself. to focus on yourself and your own identity, and to find support while you're devoting so much of your energy and time to caring for and supporting someone else. When I talk about caring for yourself as a caregiver, I like to think about what I call the 4 W's. These are your touchstones for making your own personal roadmap. And I say personal because everyone responds to grief differently. For your roadmap for navigating the ambiguous losses of dementia. The first W is when. When probably the bulk of your time is devoted to the person you're caring for, it can be hard to also prioritize yourself. And doing that can bring on feelings of guilt. But try to remember that airplane mask analogy, because when you make time for yourself, it will mean that you can provide better care for the person who's living with dementia. Being a caregiver, and especially a primary caregiver, can make it hard to find time to think about and find and use strategies toward coping with loss. And I want to note that especially during COVID, when you may find yourself under more pressure than ever and perhaps even more hard-pressed to provide support to the person you're caring for 24/7, sometimes this requires being even more creative about finding time for yourself. Maybe while your person who's living with dementia is taking a nap, you go out on your front step and you breathe some fresh air or phone a friend for even a few moments. Maybe this person goes to bed before you, so you enjoy a late night TV show when you have that quiet time. As well, time is important in terms of how long we spend in negative emotions. When you have limited time, one strategy can be to give yourself 5 minutes to feel sorry for yourself. Make sure the person you're caring for is secure on their own, and take yourself away somewhere private. Cry, scream, think, throw your pillows around, but for 5 minutes. Set yourself a timer if you have to. It can be so important to find yourself moments of release, to not only acknowledge the toughest of the losses and emotions that you're facing, but to truly feel them. And to try, if you can, not to judge yourself for feeling those things, but to let those feelings come, because there's nothing wrong with having them. And as important as it is to use this time to acknowledge and name these feelings, the next step is to find ways to feel comforted and grounded despite them at the end of that 5-minute timer, for example, and to feel as though you can keep going, because you can. Where? For a caregiver of a person living with dementia, when we're thinking about how to cope with these losses, the space, or the where in this equation, can mean physically needing space and time away from the person you're caring for in order to recharge. So it's important to figure out how to find that space. Is your person living with you? Can they be safe on their own if you were to leave the house or take yourself into another room or go outside? Is the person that you know who's living with dementia no longer living at home? Is the question more about, do you need to give yourself permission to give yourself space when you're not with them at certain points? Spaces and places tend to hold a lot of meaning for us and can make a big difference in how comfortable or at ease we feel. Ask yourself, where do you feel safe and supported? Do you have a favorite chair to sit on in your home? Do you enjoy standing on your lawn and breathing in some fresh air? Do you have a favorite cafe that you like to pick up a hot drink from? Who? It's important to identify what the right way to acknowledge and feel your loss is for you. And this may mean talking to somebody who you know will understand and listen to you. For some people, this will mean someone who is going through a similar and common experience, like a peer who's also caring for someone with dementia, or a support group for spousal caregivers like we have offered at AGI. Here we have counseling and other support, including activity programming for people living with dementia and more. It could also mean speaking to a trusted friend or a professional who understands. This can also mean seeking out medical or other professional support. For instance, if you feel that your caregiving experience is taking a toll on your own health. Maybe you feel you may be experiencing depression. Who does not necessarily just mean who you should talk to. It's also important to think about people who may be able to help you out in different ways, like maybe a friend or a neighbor who could go for a walk with your partner or parent or person who has dementia so that you can catch a break as the caregiver. Or maybe your child or your cousin is able to do a grocery run for you, or other forms of support like that, that you can rely on other people for. I will note again that stigma gets in the way. There's a lot of stigma around dementia, and it can be hard to find people who properly listen without trying to take it away from you or invalidate you. Think about who truly listens and who truly makes you feel understood, and seek out those people. It's common to see old and even very close connections start to slip away with dementia. And sometimes this may be out of people's fear or their lack of understanding, or people's own personal discomfort of any kind. It's not your job to make them feel better about what you're going through, but sometimes it can be helpful to be honest about what's going on and tell them what you need from them. Even if it's just telling them, hey, I'm still here, give me a call every so often. A client recently said to me that with grief, you change your address book. You may find that some people might be having their own trouble coping with the disease and the person you know, or they're not providing as much support to you. But you may also find that you can make new connections with people who do understand in places that you might not even expect. Seek out, notice, and rely on the connections that make you feel good and understood. And again, that's something you can reach out to AGI about. We've spoken about how when loss is acknowledged and understood, it helps because it gives you permission to grieve. I think it's also important to maintain social connections, new and old, not only in terms of speaking about loss, but maybe even just spending time with someone who cares about you, who can help you feel supported, even if you're not thinking or talking about dementia or your role as a caregiver, just to take a break. If you're not a big talker, and a lot of people aren't, do you like to write? Sometimes journaling can be a way to express and name how you're feeling to yourself. Are you a more creative person in terms of how you express yourself? Would it help to paint or draw what you're feeling? Expressing loss in creative ways can be a very powerful tool as well. This may not work for everyone, but you can talk to yourself. It can sometimes help to process things out loud, even and especially if no one is listening. The fourth W is what? So with this one, we ask ourselves, what can you do to take care of yourself? This may mean holding on to favorite activities to maintain your own well-being and your personhood, of which being a caregiver is one part. Maybe when you're being active and engaged in something that interests you, like exercise or art, that helps you feel comfortable. There's a whole world of online workout videos in these COVID times, and online museum tours, and other ways to find your what. Anything you can do that helps you feel good and cared for and grounded. Maybe it means going to the hair salon that makes you feel good. Maybe it means picking up your crochet hook and working on a fun and a manageable goal that you can craft towards. It's important to forgive yourself and to give yourself permission to take the time and do these things. I find that thinking about our 5 senses can be helpful in mapping out the what of caring for yourself as a caregiver. Talking and being listened to can be a big tool in terms of using our senses to take good care of ourselves. And there are also other ways to engage our senses as a way of taking care and giving yourself time and space to reflect on what you're feeling and acknowledge it to yourself. So taste. People talk about comfort food. Eating a favorite food can be a way of coping. Caregivers often spend a lot of time making sure that the person they're caring for has proper nutrition taken care of. But we've also talked about the need to take care of yourself first. And taking care of yourself also means ensuring that you're eating enough healthy food. Smell. Some people are into scented candles or creams or diffusers. You could even try finding the smell of your favorite food cooking, or a smell that's associated with important memories, like a soap that brings back childhood memories. Touch. I think there's a whole world of tactile things out there that can be really powerful. For some, it might be digging into the dirt of your garden and pulling out weeds. And that's also valuable because it's something productive that you can do that might help you feel fulfilled in another aspect beyond being a caregiver. It's important to remember the things that you're good at and the things you're proud of about yourself as related to being a caregiver, but also beyond. Maybe in terms of touch, it's comforting for you to pet the cat. Maybe physical touch, like hugs, brings you comfort. And obviously COVID makes challenges for that. But it's also possible, as we're doing right now, to find other ways to connect despite the isolation of not being face-to-face. Sound. Earlier on, we spoke about the value of sometimes taking a limited amount of time, maybe that 5 minutes for yourself. And maybe that means listening to a sad song that helps you immerse yourself in your feelings and allow yourself that moment and then bring yourself back. Maybe it means taking 5 minutes to listen to a happy tune that motivates you. Maybe you enjoy meditation, recordings, a beautiful podcast or a radio show, music that's associated with positive memories for you. Or maybe you want to take yourself to a quiet place outside and just hear some birds chirping. Another point that I'd like to leave you with is that we spoke earlier about how dementia often elicits a lot of anticipatory grief, that feeling of worrying and wondering about what lies ahead. It's important to feel those feelings and do the thinking and planning that you need to do to be prepared for the future and to ease your own grief down the line. But it's also important to make sure to return and ground yourself in the present moment. And relying on your 5 senses is an excellent way to bring yourself back to earth and feel grounded and present. So as an example, in your own space, wherever you are right now, I'd like to ask if everyone can reflect on, think for yourself about 5 things. So think about one thing that you can taste right now, or maybe the last thing that you tasted. One thing that you can smell. 2 things that you can touch. 2 things that you can hear. And 3 things that you can see. Maybe you're feeling worried about COVID and what lies ahead. Maybe you're wondering what these winter months are going to look like, or how things will continue to change for the person that you know who has dementia. These kinds of worries are real and they're scary. But try to focus on how right now you're sitting comfortably, maybe. You can feel the support of your chair underneath you. You can feel your breath going in and out. You can hear the sound of a car passing on the street, or maybe the dryer is running, or there's a breeze in the trees. You can see me and you can see my slides here on the screen, and maybe you can look around at the color of the paint on your walls to remind yourself of what's going on in the here and now. Right now, you're okay and you know what's happening around you and you're in control. And that's an exercise you can try to take home with you and try again. So I'd like to thank everyone for joining me here today, and I'll flip back over to Megan now.
Thank you so much, Rennie. It's a difficult topic to address. Ambiguous loss is something that I think in society we're starting to talk a bit more, but we need to keep talking, keep the conversation going. Does anyone have any questions? Feel free to write them in the chat. And right now I don't see any. I think everyone is probably processing everything that's happening. What I really liked, Rennie, was how not only did you address the actual losses, but you gave strategies to be mindful of the now and to learn how to adapt to what's in front of us and focus on what we can control and what we can't. So I just want to, I don't have any questions, so we will close out just to let everyone know that you will be getting an email with a survey with future lecture topics. Please be sure to fill that out. It's very important so that we can continue to deliver courses, workshops, and lectures that are relevant to you. Also, just to let everyone know, I know there was a comment that someone could not access the link for past lectures. What we will do now is we will send a link to our Alzheimer Group's YouTube page. And from there, you will see some of the lectures that are available to you. And this lecture will also be available there. So rest assured you will be able to see and review any of the material. So thank you so much. Thank you, Rennie, for the very thorough lecture, and I hope to see everyone again at the next lecture. Take care.
Thank you.